An unconditional surrender is a surrender in which no guarantees are given to the surrendering party. In modern times, unconditional surrenders most often include guarantees provided by international law. Announcing that only unconditional surrender is acceptable puts psychological pressure on the weaker adversary, but may also prolong hostilities. Perhaps the most notable unconditional surrender was by the Axis powers in World War II. Examples: Banu Qurayza during Muhammad's era after the Battle of the Trench, in which the Muslims tactically overcame their opponents while suffering very few casualties. Efforts to defeat the Muslims failed, and Islam became influential in the region. As a consequence, the Muslim army besieged the neighborhood of the Banu Qurayza tribe, leading to their unconditional surrender. Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon Bonaparte escaped from his enforced exile on the island of Elba, among other steps that the delegates of the European powers at the Congress of Vienna took was to issue a statement on the 13th of March 1815 declaring Napoleon Bonaparte to be an outlaw. The text includes the following paragraphs: by thus breaking the convention which he had established him in the island of Elba, Bonaparte destroys the only legal title on which his existence depended, and by appearing again in France with projects of confusion and disorder, he has deprived himself of the protection of the law, and has manifested to the universe that there can be neither peace nor truce with him. The powers consequently declare that Napoleon Bonaparte has placed himself without the pale of civil and social relations, and that, as an enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world, he has rendered himself liable to public vengeance. Consequently, as he was an outlaw when Napoleon Bonaparte surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon at the end of the 100 Days, he was not protected by military law or international law as a head of state, and so the British were under no legal obligation to either accept his surrender or to spare his life. American Civil War. The most famous early use of the phrase occurred during the 1862 Battle of Fort Donelson in the American Civil War. Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union Army received a request for terms from the fort's commanding officer, Confederate Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner. Grant's reply was that no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Quote, when news of Grant's victory, one of the Union's first in the Civil War, was received in Washington, D.C., newspapers remarked that Ulysses S. Grant's first two initials, U.S., stood for Unconditional Surrender, which would later become his nickname. However, subsequent surrenders to Grant were not unconditional. When Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, Grant agreed to allow the men under Lee's command to go home under parole and to keep sidearms and private horses. Generous terms were also offered to John C. Pemberton at Vicksburg and to Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina. Grant was not the first and only officer in the Civil War to use such a term. The first instance came when Confederate Brigadier General Lloyd Tillman asked for terms of surrender during the Battle of Fort Henry. Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote replied, "No sir, your surrender will be unconditional." Even at Fort Donelson, when a Confederate messenger first approached Brig. Gen. Charles F. Smith, Grant's subordinate, for terms of surrender, Smith stated, "I'll have no terms with rebels with guns in the hands. My terms are unconditional and immediate surrender." The messenger was passed along to Grant, but there is no evidence that either Foote or Smith influenced Grant's decision later on that day. In 1863, Ambrose Burnside forced an unconditional surrender of the Cumberland Gap and 2,300 Confederate soldiers, and in 1864 Union General Gordon Granger forced an unconditional surrender of Fort Morgan. World War II. The use of the term was revived during World War II at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, when American President Franklin D. Roosevelt sprang it on the other Allies and the press as the objective of the war against the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And when President Roosevelt suddenly announced this surrender condition at Casablanca, he did so referencing U.S. Grant and the fact that the famous general's initials, since the Civil War, had also come to stand for unconditional surrender. The term was also used at the end of World War II when Japan surrendered to the Allies. Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin disapproved of the demand for unconditional surrender, as did most senior U.S. officials. It has been estimated that it helped prolong the war in Europe through its usefulness to German domestic propaganda that used it to encourage further resistance against the Allied armies, and its suppressive effect on the German resistance movement, since even after a coup against Adolf Hitler, those Germans, and particularly those German generals who might have been ready to throw Hitler over and were able to do so, were discouraged from making the attempt by their inability to extract from the Allies any sort of assurance that such action would improve the treatment meted out to the country. Quote, "It has also been argued that without the demand for unconditional surrender, Central Europe might not have fallen behind the Iron Curtain. It was a policy that the Soviet Union accepted with alacrity, probably because a completely destroyed Germany would facilitate Russia's post-war expansion program. One reason for the policy was that the Allies wished to avoid a repetition of the stab-in-the-back myth that arose in Germany after World War I, which attributed Germany's loss to betrayal by Jews, Bolsheviks, and socialists. The myth was used by the Nazis in the propaganda. It was felt that an unconditional surrender would ensure that the German people knew they had lost the war themselves and not because of a stab in the back." East Pakistan on the 16th of December 1971, Lt. Gen. A.K. Niazi, CO of Pakistan Armed Forces located in East Pakistan, signed the Instrument of Surrender, handing over the command of his forces to Indian Army under General Jagmeet Singh Arora. This led to the surrender of 93,000 soldiers of the Pakistan's East Command and cessation of hostilities between the Pakistani Armed Forces and the Indian Armed Forces, along with the guerrilla forces, the Mukti Bahini. The signing of this unconditional surrender document gave Geneva Convention guarantees for the safety of the surrendered soldiers and completed the independence of Bangladesh. Surrender at discretion. In siege warfare, the demand that the garrison unconditionally surrender to the besiegers is traditionally phrased as surrender at discretion. For example, at the siege of Stirling during the 1745 Jacobite rebellion, Charles thereupon sent a verbal message to the magistrates, requiring them instantly to surrender the town, but, at the solicitation, they obtained till 10 o'clock next day to make up their minds. The message was taken into consideration at a public meeting of the inhabitants, and anxiously debated, the majority having come to the resolution that it was impossible to defend the town with the handful of men within. 2 deputies were sent to Bannockburn, the headquarters of the Highland Army, who offered to surrender to terms, stating that, rather than surrender at discretion, as required, they would defend the town to the last extremity. After a negotiation, which occupied the greater part of Tuesday, the following terms of capitulation were agreed upon. It was also seen at the Battle of the Alamo, when Santa Anna asked Jim Bowie and William B. Travis for unconditional surrender. Even though Bowie wished to surrender unconditionally, Travis refused, retaliated by firing a cannon at Santa Anna's army. and wrote in his final dispatches, "The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion, otherwise the garrison are to be put to the sword. If the fort is taken, I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat." The phrase surrender at discretion is still used in treaties. For example, the Rome Statute that entered into force on July 1, 2002, specifies under Article 8 War Crimes, Paragraph 2b, that other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict, within the established framework of international law, namely, any of the following acts: killing or wounding a combatant who, having laid down his arms or having no longer means of defense, has surrendered at discretion. This wording in the Rome Statute is taken almost word for word from Article 23 of the 1907 IV Hague Convention, the laws and customs of war on land. It is especially forbidden, to kill or wound an enemy who, having laid down his arms, or having no longer means of defense, has surrendered at discretion, and is part of the customary laws of war.